Mischievous, beautiful, and enchanting, fairies are perhaps some of the strangest creatures to inhabit our world. With a temperamental personality and an aptitude for magic, they are at once troublesome, delightful, and occasionally malicious. The fair folk are very interesting in that they are a diverse culture of seemingly unrelated creatures. Elves, goblins, imps, sprites, wisps, nymphs, and dryads, all and more are part of fairy kind. One would imagine there to be a lot of social friction between these various classes of creature, but this is entirely mitigated through their utter devotion to their monarchs. Perhaps the most noticeable and important aspect of the fairies is their rigid monarchy. All lesser fae act in service to their king and queen. The isolationist nature of the fair folk leaves us with very little to work with in regards to the formation of their societies. However, we are not entirely ignorant of their world. The Unseelie and Seelie court are the primary monarchical societies of the fairies that have interacted with human beings. Where the former Unseelie court is more malicious in intent, the Seelie court acts in a more whimsical manner. However, the goals, culture, and economics of these societies remain a mystery to us. Despite including the ingenious goblins and powerful elves, they have not risen to the same level of prominence that we would come to expect from a highly skilled human society. Instead, the intentions of both of these kingdoms appear to be entirely random. Part of the difficulty in discovering more intimate details about the fair folk is that they exist in a place that is not entirely of this world. Despite resembling Earth, their land is inherently magical, and is quite dangerous for humans to traverse without some kind of magical aid. And, which is more, is that there is a significant time difference between our world and theirs. Where time moves much faster in ours, a few hours in their world can easily translate into the difference of several decades in our own. Like other similar creatures, the fairies have access to magical abilities, and are able to warp reality at their whim. Despite possessing this tremendous power, their queer psychology leads them to remaining hidden and generally not taking advantage of their amazing natural gifts. However, their existence is somewhat of a threat to our own. Often the pranks of the Seelie court has resulted in a rather traumatic experience for more than one person, and have given or caused harm to our social fabric. These consequences have been triggered by such things as the fairies transforming peoples into animals or sparking infidelity. More malicious acts such as kidnapping newly born babies or even outright war, though uncommon, are not entirely unheard of. While we have certainly tried to prevent even the lesser of these intrusions from occurring, the fairies simply make use of their magic and irresistible glamour to ensure that they carry out their acts entirely unmolested. Only the greatest among us have been able to resist their power and charms, and even then, only in a limited capacity. A strange and mysterious species of creature, the fair folk are certainly some of the most enchanting yet concerning creatures to exist. Although we live in relative peace with them now, who knows when we might fall victim to another one of their pranks or schemes. We can only hope to pass through life unnoticed by these paradoxical entities. Perhaps the most popular creature in modern culture, the various fair folk of the world are widely represented in fantasy media. From playful sprites to beautiful elves, and even mischievous and grumpy imps and goblins. Fairy kind the world over is very widely depicted in popular culture. From video games, films, books, art, and even poetry, fairies have permeated the marrow of fantasy fiction all over the world, giving rise to the term fairy tale. Such is the grandeur of their popularity. Fairy art, particularly those related to sprites, is in fact a particularly popular form of art, with many famous illustrators and painters engaging in it. A predominantly European creature, fairies became particularly popular after the realist movement in art, where the fantastical elements combined with the careful rendering techniques of realism led to famous high-quality artwork that is commonly associated with fairies in our modern world. Two major cultural touchstones led to the modern predominance of fairies. Firstly, Shakespeare's depiction of the Seelie court in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and later elves and dwarves in the Tolkien fantasy world represented in Lord of the Rings. The latter work of fiction is especially important to the development of the fairy myth, as it was a decisive point at which the various subspecies of fairfolk became manifestly different from one another, and even opposed to one another in the case of elves and goblins. It is clear that fairies are by far and away some of the most popular fantastical creatures to have ever been created. Nowhere is this more apparent than with the Cottingley fairies hoax. In 1917, a pair of girls forged a collection of 5 photos depicting them apparently interacting with real fairies. This hoax was so successful that even Sherlock Holmes author Arthur Conan Doyle was taken in by their seeming authenticity. Direct depictions of fairies are not the only effect they have had on popular culture. Artifacts of nomenclature such as the Wild Hunt and large swathes of chivalric romance stories are heavily influenced by these creatures. Indeed, they play an important role in European-based myth and folklore. Although the nature of and context in which these creatures appear may change and be reimagined, there is no doubt that they will remain with us for a long, long time. A primarily European creature, modern fairies have been diversified into various unique creatures that are held as quite distinct from one another. As has been discussed up until now, elves, goblins, sprites, imps, dwarves, wisps, and all other manner of creature were originally considered to be part of the same collection of creatures. Only with recent fictions did a decisive differentiation between them and any kind of meaningful discrimination come into existence. This variety between the fairies of the world is curious considering how closely related they are to one another historically, and this variety must be borne in mind when attempting to consider the origin of these creatures. Initially, we look to King James in his dissertation Demonology. James attempts to explain the existence of fairies from a predominantly Christian point of view. His dissertation explains that the various fairies are summoned as familiars to witches and other magical practitioners, and their variation is then explained by the fact that they are essentially demons. What is particularly interesting about King James's representation of the fairy is that he is creating a post hoc explanation for the existence of these creatures, implying an origin that is far older than Christian mythologies. When we consider that these demonic accusations were often, by Christian scholars, focused upon elements of pagan religions, we might look to those cultures for the origin of fairies. Alas, due to Christian dismantling, it is very difficult to find a single group of pagan creatures that could be definitively called fairies. However, unlike more noticeable creatures such as werewolves, this lack of information is itself perhaps a clue as to the role fairies played in pagan culture. From the lack of prominence of any one particular type of fairy in history, we can determine that these creatures were, individually, of little importance to pagan culture, yet their collective existence speaks a whole other truth. Considering that pagan traditions would find people worshipping significant features of the environment, such as a tree or rock, a ring of mushrooms, or even a river, it is then not difficult to conclude that fairies, as a collective, were the various deities that were connected to these significant environmental features. This variety in objects of worship also explains why we see such a variety in appearance between all the fairies, where the features of the object of worship leads directly to the appearance of the god associated with it. Where goblins look like toads and moles and other creatures associated with the soil, and sprites resemble pollinating insects as a form of floral deity. With the waning of pagan tradition, it's not difficult to understand how the purpose of the fairies would fall out of common memory, ultimately leading to the strange collection of seemingly unrelated creatures we see today, their true purpose having fallen by the wayside. A strange origin for a strange set of creatures, fallen gods now regaled to creatures of malice or props in our fiction. Their history is as tragic as it is fascinating. Although we may never truly be able to verify this history, it is nevertheless a fascinating thing to consider next time we see another fictional depiction of these creatures. Considering the diversity of fairy kind, it is particularly difficult to reify the creatures as a whole. However, by identifying key characteristics of the creatures, we may come to find some commonalities upon which we can work to render a believable being. The most striking aspect of the fairy is its appearance. Where most mythical creatures are quite bestial in nature, or a fusion of man and animal, the fairy has an almost entirely human visage. This feature is particularly interesting when we consider how similar modern elves are to human beings, where the difference between the two groups is almost superficial. At first we might turn to the mermaid for inspiration to render this myth real, where convergent evolution could certainly explain how a myriad of creatures could come to resemble one another. Looking at other primates and various simian creatures, we see that the humanoid form in general is a viable strategy, with only a few small changes such as hands and bipedalism required to complete the transformation into something we could recognize as human. However, a more interesting possibility is presented in the Laundry Files series. Written by Charles Stross, the Laundry Files tells the story of Lovecraftian bureaucracy mixed in with computer science. The novel, entitled The Nightmare Stacks, introduces trans-dimensional elves to the series. While the narrative is ancillary to our consideration, a particular detail is of interest to our present goal, which is the novel's justification for the existence of elves. Stross's Fae are, like ourselves, the descendants of proto-humans. The differences between his fair folk and ourselves is similar to the differences found between ourselves and other hominids, such as Homo sapien neanderthalis and, more appropriately, Homo sapien idaltu. In the story, small differences in cranial development lead to a drastically different social structure among the Fae, and so, despite their seemingly human appearance, pointed ears aside, they are psychologically different in very meaningful ways, much the same as we find in traditional legends about elves, accounting for their queer sense of humor and odd value system. This concept can be further expanded to include the various statures and appearances among fair folk. Pygmies, such as those found in Central Africa, Indonesia, and Australia, bear testament to the feasibility of this idea. Sprites, however, are quite difficult to reify, for as there is an upper limit to the size of the human body, so too is there a lower limit at which our lungs, thermoregulatory systems, digestive, and sensory systems are able to function. Nevertheless, this concept certainly holds water, and we might even consider this proto-human origin to be a clear answer as to how fairies might come about. Alas, a more sensible answer than this is quite difficult to come by, and besides invoking more fantastic elements, we would be hard-pressed to find better reifications. And so, we can conclude that, generally speaking, the fairies of myth are, at least superficially, rather possible and indeed have existed. A surprising turn of events. Considering the private nature of fairies and how we often find isolated tribes in remote regions of the world, the fair folk may well be hiding deep within the unexplored parts of the world, and it might only be a matter of time before we find them.